police detective accuses a black homeless man of stealing from a wealthy businessman for simply being near the scene of the crime. While the homeless man sits in jail, the millionaire businessman uncovers a shocking truth that changes both of their lives forever. The city streets were quiet, the occasional car rolling by, headlights cutting through the fog. Jamal Turner stood in the alley behind Cole Enterprises, hands shaking as he rifled through a trash bin. It was late, far past midnight, and the hunger gnawed at his stomach, relentless and unforgiving. His worn-out jacket hung loosely on his thin frame, offering little protection against the cold. A distant siren wailed, but Jamal paid it no mind. He found a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in plastic and pulled it out, inspecting it under the dim light of a nearby street lamp. He was about to take a bite when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the alley. "Hey, you there!" a voice barked, sharp and commanding. Jamal turned to see two police officers approaching, their flashlights blinding him. He instinctively raised his hands, the sandwich falling to the ground. "Stay right there," one of them, a tall man with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression, ordered. It was Detective William Harris, known for his quick judgments and impatience. The second officer, younger and less sure of himself, stood a few steps behind. Jamal blinked, trying to make sense of the situation. "I ain't done nothing," he said, his voice calm but weary. "Just looking for something to eat." Harris's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, the flashlight beam never leaving Jamal's face. "You think I'm stupid? What are you doing out here, in the middle of the night, right next to a building that just got robbed?" Jamal's heart sank. "Robbed? I didn't know anything about that. I was just passing through." The younger officer glanced nervously at Harris, who ignored him, moving even closer to Jamal. "Passing through? Don't play games with me. You're homeless, and you're here. That's all the proof I need." Jamal shook his head, desperate but calm. "I swear, man, I don't know nothing about no robbery." Harris snorted, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Yeah, right. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's what they all say." The younger officer shifted uneasily, but said nothing. Jamal stood still, his hand still raised, trying not to make any sudden moves. He'd been through this before, being judged for how he looked, how he lived. It was always the same story. Before he could say anything more, another figure appeared at the edge of the alley. Richard Cole, the CEO of the very company that had been robbed, stepped forward, his tailored suit standing in stark contrast to the dirty surroundings. He looked at Jamal with cold, detached eyes, sizing him up in an instant. "Is this the guy?" Richard asked, his voice crisp, cutting through the tension. Harris nodded. "Found him right here next to the scene. Seems pretty clear to me." Richard looked Jamal over, his expression with slight doubt. "Well, if you've got him, that should be it. Wrap it up." Jamal felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He wasn't a criminal, but it didn't matter. His fate was already decided in their eyes. "I didn't do it," he muttered, but no one was listening. Harris motioned to the younger officer, who pulled out handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." As the cuffs clicked shut around Jamal's wrists, he glanced at Richard, hoping for a sign of doubt, a glimmer of understanding. But Richard was already turning away, his mind on other things. Jamal was led to the waiting police car, the cold metal of the cuffs biting into his wrists. The city lights blurred around him as the reality of his situation sunk in. Once again, he was being punished for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, his appearance enough to make him guilty in the eyes of the world. The media would have a field day with this. Another homeless man, another easy target. Jamal didn't stand a chance. The sun was just beginning to rise as Richard Cole sat in his corner office, the city skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. His office, sleek and minimalist, was filled with sharp angles and modern furniture, much like Richard himself, efficient, practical, and cold. He was flipping through reports, but his mind wasn't on the numbers in front of him. His thoughts kept drifting back to the robbery from the night before. It was a clean operation, too clean. A few high-end electronics and confidential files were stolen, but there was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no alarms tripped. The security cameras hadn't picked up anything unusual except for that homeless man, Jamal Turner, rummaging through the trash outside the building. But something about it didn't sit right with Richard. He knew robberies. This wasn't just some opportunistic theft by a random drifter. His office door swung open, and his assistant, Sophia Martinez, walked in, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She was always composed, always on top of things, with her neatly pressed suit and her hair tied back in a tight bun. Today was no different. "Morning, Mr. Cole," she greeted, placing a fresh cup of coffee on his desk. "I've got the police report on the robbery." "Thanks," Richard replied without looking up. Sophia hovered for a moment, watching him skim through the documents. It's awful, isn't it? But at least they caught the guy. Richard paused, glancing up at her. You mean the homeless man? She nodded. Yes, Jamal Turner. The police are convinced he's the one. It makes sense, doesn't it? He was right there. Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the report in his hands. It does make sense, but... Sophia raised an eyebrow, her expression perfectly neutral. Richard rubbed his temple, thinking out loud. There's no way someone like him could have gotten inside. There was no forced entry. And how would he have known what to take? Those files weren't random, Sophia. They were targeted. He doesn't seem like the kind of person who'd pull off something this precise. Sophia tilted her head, as if considering his words, though there was a slight edge to her voice when she replied, With respect, Mr. Cole, I think you're overthinking it. The man's homeless. He probably took whatever he could get his hands on. Richard stared at the report again, but her words didn't settle his unease. He set the papers down and turned toward the window, watching the city wake up below. You might be right, he said, his tone distant, but something still feels off. If this guy is guilty, it'll show in time. But what if we're wrong? What if there's more to this? Sophia stood quietly for a moment before walking closer, placing a hand lightly on the back of his chair. I understand your concerns, Richard, but it's not your job to solve this. The police are handling it. They're trained for this sort of thing, aren't they? Richard gave a small nod. Yeah, I suppose they are. But even as he said it, the doubt gnawed at him. This wasn't about trusting the police. It was about trusting the narrative that had been handed to him, the one that said people like Jamal Turner were always guilty. But Richard hadn't made his fortune by trusting the obvious. He made it by questioning everything. Sophia stepped back, giving him space. Is there anything else you need from me? No, Richard said quietly. That'll be all for now. Sophia smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. I'll be in my office if you need anything. As she left, Richard leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He could still see Jamal, handcuffed and being led away by the police, his expression a mixture of resignation and frustration. What if the man was telling the truth? What if, like so many before him, he was being judged simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time? The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking his thoughts. Richard glanced at the screen and saw it was Detective Harris. He picked up. Cole here. Mr. Cole. Harris's voice came through, rough and impatient. I just wanted to update you. We've got Turner in custody and everything's lining up. He hasn't admitted anything yet, but he will. These guys always do. Richard's fingers tightened around the phone. What do you have on him exactly? Enough to keep him locked up for a while, Harris replied dismissively. He was right there, wasn't he? Near the scene. No one else was. Richard's jaw clenched. Being near the scene doesn't make him guilty, Harris. What about the security system? The entry logs? Any evidence at all that puts him inside? Harris hesitated. We're still looking into all that, but trust me, this guy's bad news. Once we get through to him, he'll fold. Richard's silence stretched long enough to make Harris uncomfortable. Look, Harris added, I know you're worried about your business, but I've got this under control. Let me do my job. Richard exhaled slowly. Fine, but make sure you're doing your job thoroughly, Detective. I don't want this case closed until all the facts are in. He hung up without waiting for a reply. As Richard sat there in the quiet of his office, the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave him. He had built his empire by knowing when something was wrong. And right now, something was definitely wrong. The city jail was a cold, sterile place. Harsh fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows across the dull gray walls. Richard Cole's polished shoes clicked against the concrete floor as he followed the guard down the narrow hallway, his tailored suit feeling out of place in the dim, oppressive surroundings. They stopped in front of a small room with a glass partition. On the other side, Jamal Turner sat on a metal bench, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked thinner than Richard remembered, the loose fabric of his jacket hanging off his shoulders. His eyes were tired, and his face bore the marks of a man who had been worn down by life. Richard stood there for a moment, staring at Jamal through the glass. He could hear the faint buzz of the intercom that would let them speak, but he hesitated before sitting down. Why was he here? He had nothing to gain from this visit, and yet something about the way the case had unfolded gnawed at him, refusing to let go. Jamal looked up as Richard took his seat across from him, their eyes meeting for the first time since the night of the arrest. There was no anger in Jamal's gaze, just exhaustion. Richard picked up the phone attached to the wall, and after a brief pause, Jamal did the same. I wasn't expecting you, Jamal said, his voice low but steady through the phone. I wasn't expecting to be here, Richard replied, leaning forward slightly. But I need to hear your side of the story. Jamal sighed, rubbing his thumb against the chain of his handcuffs. Not much to tell. I've been living on the streets, scraping by. I was looking for food that night, not trouble. I didn't even know what had happened until the cops grabbed me. Richard studied Jamal's face, trying to read the man in front of him. So, you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Jamal let out a bitter laugh. That's how it always goes, isn't it? You look like me, you live like me, and people see what they want to see. Doesn't matter if you did anything wrong or not. Richard didn't respond right away, the words sinking in. He had seen it himself. The way people avoided looking at the homeless. The way they made snap judgments based on appearance alone. He had made those same judgments the night of the robbery. Jamal spoke again, his voice quieter this time. Look, man, I'm not a saint. I've done things I'm not proud of. But this? He shook his head. I didn't steal anything. I didn't even know what that place was. Richard glanced down at the file he had brought with him, flipping it open on the table in front of him. He scanned the notes quickly. The police report listing Jamal as the prime suspect. But the evidence was thin. Too thin, Richard thought, for such a high-stakes case. I'm not saying I believe you, Richard said carefully, but there are some things about this case that don't add up. If you didn't do it, someone else had to. Jamal leaned forward, the first spark of hope in his eyes. Why do you care? You're a rich man. You've got your life, your business. Why do you even care what happens to me? Richard didn't have an immediate answer. Maybe it was because, in some part of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was a bigger game being played here. Or maybe it was because for the first time in a long while, he had been forced to confront the fact that not everyone got a fair shake in life. People like Jamal didn't have second chances handed to them. Maybe I just want the truth, Richard said finally. Jamal looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for signs of deceit. The truth, he repeated quietly. The truth is, people like me don't get heard. We get locked up because it's easier than listening to our stories. Richard frowned, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. If there's something I can do to help you, I will, but I need to know for sure. You didn't have anything to do with the robbery? I swear on everything I have left, Jamal said, meeting Richard's gaze. I didn't do it. Richard sat back, considering. He had built his career on being able to read people, on knowing when someone was lying. Right now, Jamal looked beaten, but honest. There was no trace of deception in his eyes. He leaned forward again, his voice firm. I'll look into it. If you're telling the truth, I'll find out who really did this. But if you're lying, I'm not lying, Jamal interrupted, his voice steady. I've got nothing left to lose, man. Why would I lie? Richard nodded, his mind made up. All right, I'll start digging. Jamal sat back in his chair, the weight of the cuffs dragging his arms down. You ever think the worst part about being guilty is looking guilty? Richard didn't respond, but the words hung in the air between them. He had heard enough. He stood, giving Jamal one last glance before hanging up the phone. As Richard walked out of the jail, the cold morning air hit him like a wall. His mind was already racing with possibilities. He had the resources, the connections, and the drive to find the truth. And if Jamal really was innocent, then someone else was pulling the strings, hiding in the shadows. Someone who thought a man like Jamal wouldn't matter enough to fight back. But they were wrong. Richard sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen of his laptop. The quiet hum of the city outside his office window faded into the background as he scrolled through company records, security logs, and financial reports. Something was off, and he was determined to figure out what. Sophia knocked gently on the door before entering, her usual confident air radiating through the room. Mr. Cole, I've got the latest financial summaries for you to review, she said, setting a stack of neatly organized papers on the corner of his desk. Is everything all right? Richard didn't look up immediately, his fingers still tapping the keys. Fine, he muttered, just going over some things. Sophia raised an eyebrow but remained silent for a moment, watching him with a subtle, curious gaze. You're still looking into the robbery, aren't you? Yeah, Richard replied, finally lifting his head to meet her eyes. I've been going through the access logs, trying to see who was in the building that night. Why? Sophia asked, her voice calm but with an undertone of surprise. The police already made an arrest. It seems pretty clear, doesn't it? Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. Maybe, but I've been thinking. There's no sign Jamal ever made it inside the building. No forced entry. No cameras catching him going in. How would he have even known what to take? Sophia's expression remained neutral, though there was a flicker of something behind her eyes. Well, maybe he had help. These things aren't always as straightforward as they seem. Richard nodded slowly, considering her words. Maybe, but it still doesn't explain why the security system didn't alert anyone. Someone used a key card to access those files. And I've been going through the logs. It was an internal card. Sophia shifted slightly, her hands resting on the back of the chair opposite Richard's desk. Whose card was it? I'm still narrowing it down, Richard said, his tone growing more focused. There were a few people in and out that night, but nothing that lines up with the exact time of the robbery. Sophia smiled faintly, though her eyes didn't quite match the expression. "Well, I'm sure you'll figure it out. You always do." Richard didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her face. Something about the way she had said it made him pause. He pushed the thought aside for the moment and returned his attention to the screen. As she turned to leave, Richard called after her. "Sophia, hold on a second." She stopped, turning back to face him. "Yes? I'm going to need access to some internal files, financial records, personnel logs, things that might not have been flagged by security but could show a pattern." Sophia blinked, her composure faltering ever so slightly. "What kind of pattern are you looking for?" Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Anything that stands out. Transactions that don't add up. Transfers between accounts. Discrepancies in payroll or expenses. Anything that could point to someone on the inside being involved." For the first time, Sophia's calm exterior cracked. It was just a brief flicker, barely noticeable, but Richard caught it. "I see," she said, her voice a touch cooler now. "I'll get those to you right away." She turned again, this time exiting the office with more haste than usual. Richard watched the door close behind her, his mind racing. There was something about Sophia's reaction that didn't sit right with him. She had been with him for years, always efficient, always professional. But now, there was a nervousness in her movements that hadn't been there before. He pushed the thought aside for now and turned his attention back to the logs. There it was again, the keycard entry that lined up almost perfectly with the time of the theft. The card belonged to someone in his executive team. He frowned, scrolling through the data. The card was registered to Sofia Martinez. Richard's pulse quickened as he double-checked the information. He had never once considered that Sophia, of all people, could be involved in something like this. She had been by his side through thick and thin, managing every detail of his business life, but now the evidence was pointing directly at her. He clicked through to the financial reports, searching for any anomalies that might back up his suspicions, and then he saw it. Small, almost imperceptible transfers of funds, spread out over months. Money being funneled into accounts that didn't belong to any known employee or vendor. It was well hidden, but not well enough. Richard's breath caught in his throat. Sophia had been siphoning money from the company, slowly but steadily. She must have known he would catch on eventually, which meant the robbery wasn't just about stealing electronics or files. It was about covering her tracks, creating a diversion while she made her escape. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. Everything was beginning to fall into place. Jamal hadn't been there to rob the company. He was just a convenient scapegoat, someone no one would question, someone the police and the media would automatically assume was guilty. And Sophia had played it perfectly, framing him to take the fall for her own crimes. Richard stood up, his mind racing. He couldn't believe he hadn't seen it sooner. He had trusted Sophia, and she had betrayed him in the worst possible way. There was no time to waste. He needed to confront her, but not without proof. Solid, undeniable proof that would not only clear Jamal's name, but also expose the real thief. As he gathered the necessary documents, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about righting a wrong anymore. This was personal. Richard sat behind his desk, the tension in the room palpable as he waited for Sophia. His fingers drummed softly on the wood surface, the files of evidence neatly stacked beside him. Every detail had been checked and double-checked. The money transfers, the access logs, the timeline of the robbery. It all pointed to her. The door clicked open, and Sophia entered, her usual composure intact. She carried a folder under her arm, likely full of updates she assumed Richard was waiting for. Her heels clicked lightly on the floor as she crossed the room, stopping in front of his desk. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Cole?" she asked, her tone professional, though Richard noticed the slight edge in her voice. She was tense, even if she was trying to hide it. Richard didn't immediately respond. He leaned back in his chair, studying her closely. For a brief moment, he wondered how long she had been planning this. How long had she been siphoning money from his company, all while standing by his side like a loyal assistant? "I've been going over some reports," Richard said finally, his voice measured. "There's something I need to ask you about." Sophia's eyes flickered briefly to the stack of papers on his desk, her calm facade cracking just a little. "Of course. What's this about?" Richard reached for the top file, opening it slowly, deliberately. "The night of the robbery," he began. "There was no forced entry, no alarms were triggered, and the security logs show that a key card was used to access the building." Sophia blinked, but didn't move. "Right. I remember that from the police report." Richard nodded. "I dug a little deeper, cross-referenced the access times with our internal records. It turns out the key card that was used belongs to someone in the company." Sophia's expression remained steady, but her hands tightened ever so slightly on the folder she was holding. "I went through the list of people who were here that night," Richard continued, his eyes never leaving her. It wasn't a long list, a few employees, mostly lower-level staff, but there was one name that stood out. He slid the file across the desk toward her, opening it to reveal the access log. Her name was there, plain as day. Sophia glanced down at the paper, her face carefully blank. "That's my key card," she said quietly, looking back at Richard. "But that doesn't mean I was involved. I didn't steal anything." Richard leaned forward, his voice hardening. "Your key card was used to access the files that were stolen, Sophia. And I found more than that. The financial records show small transfers of money from the company accounts. Discreet, but consistent. They all lead back to untraceable accounts, and they've been happening for months." Sophia didn't respond immediately. Her face, usually so controlled, betrayed a flicker of panic before she quickly masked it. "Richard, you don't really think I had anything to do with this, do you?" "I didn't want to," Richard replied, his voice cold. "But the evidence is all there. You've been stealing from me, and when you realized I might find out, you staged the robbery. You framed Jamal Turner to take the fall, knowing that no one would believe a homeless man over you." Sophia's eyes flashed with anger for the first time, her voice sharp as she dropped the pretense of innocence. "No one would have cared about him. He's nothing, Richard. Just some drifter the cops would pick up and forget about." Richard's stomach churned at her words. He had trusted her, worked with her for years, and now the truth was laid bare in front of him. "You betrayed me," he said, his voice low, filled with quiet fury. "You stole from me, and then you framed an innocent man to cover your tracks." Sophia straightened, her calm demeanor shattered. Her lips curled into a cold, calculated smile. "Innocent? He was perfect, Richard. You know how the world works. People like him, they're invisible. No one would have looked twice at him. And if it hadn't been for your sudden interest, he'd be in prison right now, where everyone expects him to be." Richard stood, his temper finally boiling over. "That's what you were counting on, wasn't it? That no one would care, that no one would dig any deeper. But you're wrong. I care." Sophia took a step back, her expression shifting to one of defiance. "You care now? Because you've got a conscience all of a sudden?" She scoffed. "Spare me, Richard. You wouldn't have lifted a finger if this hadn't been your company, your money." Richard's jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I didn't care at first, but I do now, and I'm going to make sure the truth comes out." Sophia laughed, though there was no warmth in it. "You think you can take me down? You don't have enough proof. And even if you did, do you really want to go public with this? It'll ruin your reputation. People will start asking how you let this happen under your nose." Richard stared at her, his anger tempered by resolve. "I'll take that risk. I'm not going to let an innocent man take the fall for what you did." "You're done, Sophia." Her eyes narrowed, her voice turning venomous. "You'll regret this." "I doubt it," Richard replied coolly. He picked up the phone on his desk, dialing security. "Send someone up to my office. I need an escort for a former employee." Sophia's face tightened with fury as she realized there was no way out. The door opened and 2 security guards entered, ready to take her away. She shot Richard one last venomous look before turning on her heel and walking out with them. As the door closed behind her, Richard sat back down, exhaling slowly. The weight of what had just happened settled on him, but the anger still burned in his chest. He had exposed the truth, but there was still work to be done. Jamal Turner was still sitting in a jail cell, branded a thief, but now Richard had the evidence to clear his name. It wasn't over yet. Richard stood in the police station, the fluorescent lights above casting a harsh glow on the room. He had been here before, but this time felt different. This time, he wasn't here to simply report a crime or check on an investigation. He was here to right a wrong. Detective William Harris approached, his expression a mix of confusion and irritation. "Mr. Cole, what brings you back here? I thought this case was all wrapped up." Richard's face remained stern. "It's not wrapped up. I'm here because you've got the wrong man." Harris raised an eyebrow, his hands resting on his hips. "The wrong man? We caught him red-handed, practically at the scene. You saw him yourself." "I saw a man near the scene, yes," Richard replied, his voice calm but firm. "But he didn't commit the robbery. Someone else did, and I have proof." Harris narrowed his eyes, his skepticism clear. "Proof, huh? What are you talking about?" Richard pulled a file from his briefcase and handed it to Harris. "Take a look. This is the real evidence. The keycard logs, financial records, security footage timestamps. It all points to someone else." Harris opened the file, flipping through the pages, his brow furrowed as he scanned the documents, and his expression gradually shifted from disbelief to realization. This is Sophia Martinez's card," Harris muttered, more to himself than to Richard. "She was the one in the building that night?" "Yes," Richard confirmed. "She used her position to access the files that were stolen, and she framed Jamal Turner to cover her tracks. She's been embezzling money from my company for months, and when she realized I might uncover it, she staged the robbery. Harris glanced up at Richard, his face hardening. And you're sure about all this? Positive, Richard said firmly. The evidence is all there. Jamal had nothing to do with this. He was just a convenient scapegoat, and you fell for it. Harris clenched his jaw, his frustration evident. I didn't fall for anything. He was at the scene. What was I supposed to think? You were supposed to investigate, Richard snapped, his patience wearing thin. Instead, you made assumptions. You arrested him because he fit the profile, because he looked guilty. But he wasn't. The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of Richard's words sinking in. Harris stood there staring at the file in his hands, clearly grappling with the reality of the situation. Finally, he exhaled sharply, snapping the file shut. All right, I'll get this sorted. We'll have to run through the proper channels, but if this checks out, and I can see that it does, we'll release Turner. Richard nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering anger. Good, and make sure this gets out to the media. They've already torn him apart. They need to know the truth. Harris grimaced, clearly not thrilled at the idea of having to backtrack in front of the press. Yeah, I'll deal with the media. This is going to be a mess. I'm not concerned with your mess, Richard replied coolly. Just make sure Jamal is cleared. Harris gave a stiff nod. Fine, I'll handle it. Richard watched as Harris walked away, his frustration still simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't enough to simply clear Jamal's name. The damage had already been done. The media had painted him as a criminal from the start, and now they would have to correct their story. But Richard knew how the news worked. Even if the truth came out, it wouldn't undo the harm that had already been done. He would have to deal with Harris soon, but first he had more important things to look after. A week later, Richard stood outside the police station, watching as Jamal Turner emerged from the building, his hands finally free of the cuffs that had held him for days. He looked worn out, his face a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. Jamal squinted against the daylight as he stepped out onto the street, blinking as if the world around him wasn't quite real. His eyes scanned the small crowd of onlookers and reporters, all of them waiting for a statement, for something to turn into their next headline. But Jamal wasn't interested in them. His gaze landed on Richard, and for a moment, neither man said a word. Then Jamal walked over, his steps slow but steady. You did it, he said quietly, almost as if he couldn't believe it. You actually cleared my name. Richard nodded. I told you I would. Jamal stared at him, 1,000 emotions flickering across his face. Relief, gratitude, anger, and something deeper, something harder to define. I didn't think anyone would listen, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. They just saw what they wanted to see. Richard looked him in the eye, his own voice firm. I'm sorry it took me so long to realize that. Jamal glanced down at the ground, shaking his head. I didn't expect much from you, to be honest. But you came through. I'm trying to make it right, Richard said. I know this doesn't change what happened, but I'm going to make sure the media knows the truth. You won't have to fight this on your own. Jamal was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. That means something, more than you know. Before Richard could respond, a reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand, already eager for a statement. Mr. Turner, how does it feel to be free after being wrongfully accused? What do you have to say about the way the police handled this case? Jamal hesitated, his jaw clenching. Richard could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. But when Jamal finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady. I'm just glad the truth came out, Jamal said, his gaze steady. But it shouldn't have taken this long, and it shouldn't take someone like Mr. Cole stepping in for people to believe that someone like me could be innocent. This is bigger than me. The reporter scribbled furiously in her notepad, but Jamal wasn't interested in the headlines she was chasing. He turned back to Richard, his expression softening just a little. Thanks again, he said simply. Richard nodded, watching as Jamal walked away from the crowd, disappearing into the city beyond. It wasn't over yet, Richard knew. Clearing Jamal's name had been just one step. Now, he had to make sure the story spread, that people knew the truth, not just about Jamal, but about the assumptions and judgments that had led to his wrongful arrest in the first place. As he stood there, the weight of the day settling over him, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just one man's story. This was a reminder of how easy it was to judge, to condemn, and how hard it was to see the truth when it was buried beneath appearances. And he wasn't going to forget that anytime soon. It had been a week since Jamal's release, and Richard hadn't stopped thinking about him. Despite everything, there was still unfinished business. Clearing Jamal's name was one thing, but Richard knew that wasn't enough. The man had lost more than just time in jail. He'd lost dignity, opportunities, and trust in a system that had failed him repeatedly. Richard sat in his office, staring out the window at the city below. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the streets, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He had spent years building his company, surrounding himself with the best people, or so he had thought. Now, the betrayal by Sophia and the injustice against Jamal weighed heavily on him. His assistant's voice buzzed through the intercom, breaking his thoughts. "Mr. Cole, Jamal Turner is here to see you." Richard sat up straighter, his heart quickening. "Send him in." The door opened, and Jamal stepped in, looking different from the last time Richard had seen him. He was still wearing the same worn-out clothes, but there was something else about him, a quiet determination in his eyes that Richard hadn't noticed before. He carried himself with a sense of purpose, as if he was ready for whatever came next, even if he didn't know what that was. "Jamal," Richard said, standing up and extending his hand. "I'm glad you came." Jamal shook his hand, his grip firm. "You said you wanted to talk. Figured I owed you at least that." Richard gestured for him to sit, and they both settled into the chairs opposite each other. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them thick with unspoken words. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," Richard began, his voice steady. "I know clearing your name was just the beginning. What happened to you was wrong, and I can't change that. But I want to help make things right, as much as I can." Jamal's eyes narrowed slightly, his posture stiffening. "What are you offering?" Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I want to offer you a job here, at my company. It's not charity. I need someone like you. Someone who understands what it's like to be on the outside. Someone who knows how the world can knock you down. You've been through things most people here can't even imagine." Jamal stared at him, his expression unreadable. "You want me to work for you, after everything that happened?" "I do," Richard said, his tone firm. "You deserve a second chance. I can see you're not a man who gives up easily, and I need someone like that on my team. This isn't about pity or making myself feel better. It's about giving you the opportunity you should have had all along." Jamal leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he considered Richard's words. His gaze was steady, thoughtful. "What kind of job are you talking about?" Richard smiled slightly. "I'm offering you a position in our operations department. You'll start from the ground up like anyone else, but I'll make sure you get the training and resources you need to move up. You've got potential, Jamal, I can see that." Jamal didn't respond immediately. He looked down at his hands, rough and calloused from years of hard living. "I don't want charity," he said quietly. "I don't need anyone feeling sorry for me." "This isn't charity," Richard replied firmly. "This is about giving you a fair shot, the same chance anyone else would get if they were in your position. You've been through hell, but I'm offering you a way out. It's up to you whether you take it." Jamal looked back up at Richard, his eyes hard but not unkind. "You're serious about this?" "I am." For a moment, Jamal was silent, his mind clearly weighing the offer. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, I'll take the job, but I'm not looking for any handouts. I'll work, and I'll earn my place. That's all I ask," Richard said, standing and offering his hand again. Jamal rose from his seat and shook Richard's hand, this time with more confidence. "I appreciate it," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I didn't expect any of this. I didn't think anyone would care enough to give me a second chance." "You've earned it," Richard replied, "and I know you won't waste it." As they stood there, the tension that had hung between them since the beginning seemed to ease. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, Richard felt like things were starting to turn in the right direction, for both of them. "I'll have HR send you the details," Richard said, releasing Jamal's hand. "You can start whenever you're ready." Jamal nodded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'll be ready." As Jamal turned to leave, Richard called out, stopping him just before he reached the door. "Jamal, one more thing." Jamal looked back, his expression curious. "I don't want this to just be a job. If you ever feel like you need something, whether it's help or just advice, you can come to me. My door's always open." Jamal considered his words, then gave a small nod. "I'll keep that in mind." He walked out of the office, the door clicking softly behind him. Richard sat back down, exhaling slowly. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace, like he had taken the first real step toward making things right. Jamal had a long way to go, but Richard knew he'd make it. Because despite everything that had happened, despite the world's assumptions, Jamal Turner was a man who wasn't going to let the past define him, and Richard was going to make sure that the future was one where Jamal had a fighting chance. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the polished glass exterior of Cole Enterprises. The city was just waking up, the streets still quiet but slowly coming to life. Jamal Turner stood outside the main entrance, his reflection mirrored in the sleek building in front of him. He adjusted the collar of his new jacket, simple but clean and fitting better than anything he had worn in years. The suit was unfamiliar, but it made him feel like he belonged. at least more than he had ever thought possible just a few weeks ago. He still wasn't used to the idea of coming to work in a place like this. The world inside this building was different from the one he had known on the streets, and every time he stepped through those doors, he felt the weight of what this opportunity meant. He took a deep breath and walked into the lobby, the polished floors gleaming under the soft lighting. The receptionist smiled politely as he approached, though Jamal could see the curiosity in her eyes, no doubt wondering about the man who had suddenly gone from being a headline to becoming one of the employees in this very building. Jamal nodded to her as he made his way to the elevators, his footsteps steady, his mind focused. He had started working in operations just a few days ago, getting a feel for the job and the people around him. The first few days had been a whirlwind of training, learning the systems, meeting his new team. Some people treated him with caution, unsure of who he was or how he had come to be here, while others, like his supervisor, had welcomed him without question, impressed by his willingness to lead. The elevator doors slid open, and Jamal stepped inside, pressing the button for the third floor. As the elevator ascended, he thought about how far he had come in such a short amount of time. Just a few weeks ago, he had been sitting in a jail cell, wrongfully accused, with no hope of getting out. And now, he had a job, a place where he could prove himself, and a path forward. The doors opened, and Jamal stepped into the operations floor. The hum of computers and quiet conversations filled the air as people worked at their desks, focused on their tasks. Jamal walked toward his own desk, the same one he had sat at for the past few days. It was a simple space, but it was his, and that meant something. His supervisor, a kind man named Martin, waved him over. "Hey, Jamal," he said with a smile. "Good to see you. How's everything going?" "Going well," Jamal replied, settling into his chair. "Just getting used to everything." Martin nodded approvingly. "You're picking it up fast. Keep that up, and you'll be moving up in no time." Jamal appreciated the encouragement, but he wasn't thinking about moving up just yet. Right now, he was focused on doing his job, proving that he deserved to be here. "Thanks," he said. "I'll keep working hard." "Good," Martin said with a nod, before walking back to his own desk. "Let me know if you need anything." Jamal turned to his computer, logging in and pulling up the tasks for the day. The work was challenging, but he liked that. It gave him something to focus on, something to pour his energy into. Every task he completed, every problem he solved, felt like another step forward, another piece of his life falling back into place. As the hours passed, Jamal lost himself in his work, the rhythm of the day settling into something almost comfortable. He still felt the occasional glance from coworkers who were curious about him, but he didn't let it bother him. He had learned to ignore the stares long ago, and here it was no different. By the time lunch rolled around, Jamal stepped out of the building to take a walk. He liked getting fresh air during breaks, clearing his head before diving back into work. As he stood outside looking out at the city, he heard a familiar voice call his name, Jamal. He turned to see Richard Cole walking toward him, dressed in his usual sharp suit, his expression relaxed but focused. Jamal nodded in greeting. "Mr. Cole." "Richard," he corrected with a small smile. "How's everything going?" "Good," Jamal said. "Getting the hang of things." "I've been hearing good things about you from Martin," Richard said. "He says you're catching on faster than most." Jamal shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Just trying to do my part." Richard studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I knew you'd make the most of this. I had no doubt." Jamal looked at Richard, the man who had not only cleared his name, but given him this chance, this new beginning. He hadn't expected any of this. Not the job, not the support, and certainly not the chance to rebuild his life in a place like this. "I won't let you down," Jamal said, his voice steady but filled with meaning. "I know you won't," Richard replied. "But this isn't just about proving something to me, Jamal. It's about you. This is your chance to rebuild, to create something better for yourself. Don't worry about the past. Focus on what's ahead." Jamal nodded, his gaze shifting back to the city. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about how things can change so fast. A few weeks ago, I didn't know if I'd ever get out of that cell." "You did," Richard said, his voice firm. "And now, you're here. Don't ever forget that you earned this. You're here because of what you've been through, and because of the strength it took to keep going." Jamal took in Richard's words, letting them sink in. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a future he could look forward to. Not just survival, but something more. Something that could be his. "Thanks," Jamal said quietly, his voice full of gratitude, "for everything." Richard smiled, nodding once. "You're welcome. And remember, if you ever need anything, guidance, advice, whatever, you know where to find me. I'll keep that in mind." Richard gave him a parting nod and turned to walk back into the building, leaving Jamal standing there, alone with his thoughts. He looked up at the towering skyscraper, then out at the city, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another day. This was a new chapter, a new beginning, and for the first time, Jamal felt like he was standing on solid ground. The world wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but he had something now that he hadn't had before, a chance. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had once scavenged for food and fought to survive on the streets. Now, those hands were working towards something better, and that was all he needed. With a deep breath, Jamal turned and walked back into the building, ready to take on whatever came next. Richard Cole sat at his desk, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, as he stared out the large office windows. The skyline looked the same as it always did, but today, it felt different. A sense of resolution had settled over him, since Jamal had started his job, a sense that they had done the right thing. But it wasn't complete. One part of the story still nagged at him, a part that had been quietly pushed aside: Detective William Harris. The man who had been so quick to arrest Jamal without proper investigation. The man who had been all too eager to close the case without looking deeper, assuming that Jamal's appearance and situation meant he was guilty. Richard had let it slide during the chaos of clearing Jamal's name, but now that things had settled, it was time to make sure there were real consequences for the way Harris had handled the case. Richard picked up the phone and dialed a familiar number. Within minutes, his contact at the district attorney's office, Robert Mitchell, answered. "Richard, long time. What can I do for you?" Robert's voice was smooth, professional, but with a hint of familiarity that came from years of working in the same circles. "I need to talk to you about Detective William Harris," Richard said, cutting straight to the point. "There's something that needs to be addressed." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh. "Harris, I've heard a few things about him recently. Why? What's going on?" Richard leaned forward in his chair, his voice tightening. "He botched a major case. Jamal Turner, the man who was wrongfully accused of robbing my company. Harris didn't do his job. He made assumptions, arrested the wrong man, and never looked deeper into the evidence. If I hadn't investigated myself, Jamal would still be in jail, and the real culprit would have gotten away." Robert was silent for a moment, processing the information. "I heard about Turner being cleared, but I didn't realize Harris was involved. Are you saying he didn't follow procedure?" "He did the bare minimum," Richard replied sharply. "He didn't even bother to question whether Jamal could have actually committed the crime. He saw a homeless man near the scene, and that was enough for him. No real investigation, no digging into the facts, just an easy arrest and a closed case." "That's serious," Robert said, his voice grave. "But you know how these things work. Harris has been on the force for a long time. He's got friends in high places. It won't be easy to hold him accountable." Richard's jaw tightened. "I don't care how long he's been on the force. He failed to do his job, and Jamal paid the price for it. I'm not asking for him to be fired overnight, but there needs to be an internal investigation. His actions can't be swept under the rug." Robert sighed again, but this time, there was a note of agreement in his tone. "You're right. If he's cutting corners and making arrests based on assumptions, that's a problem, especially in a case this high profile." Richard leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he stared out the window. Jamal Turner was an easy target because of how he looked and where he was, but it could happen to anyone. Harris needs to be held accountable, or it'll keep happening. "I can initiate an internal review," Robert said, his voice firm now. "I'll bring this up with the police commissioner and push for an official investigation into Harris's conduct. It might take time, but with the right pressure, we can get some traction on this." "That's what I want," Richard replied, his voice resolute. "It's not just about Jamal. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." "You'll need to be prepared for pushback," Robert warned. "Harris isn't the only one who operates this way, and people protect their own. But if you're willing to see this through, I'll do my part." "I'm ready for whatever comes," Richard said firmly. "This needs to happen." After a few more details were exchanged, Richard hung up the phone. He sat quietly for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. He knew Robert was right. There would be resistance. But Richard wasn't the kind of man to back down, especially not when someone like Harris had been so blatantly careless with people's lives. Later that afternoon, Richard found himself back at the police station. He had scheduled a meeting with Detective Harris, knowing full well that this conversation wouldn't be easy, but he needed to look the man in the eye and make it clear that his actions had consequences. Harris was waiting in the precinct lobby when Richard arrived, his expression neutral, but his posture tense. He was clearly not thrilled about the meeting. "Mr. Cole," Harris greeted, his tone polite but strained. "What can I do for you?" Richard didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk about the Jamal Turner case. Specifically, how you handled it." Harris's face tightened, but he kept his voice even. "I thought that was over and done with. The charges were dropped, and the real culprit was found. Turner's free now." "It's not over," Richard said sharply. Jamal might be free, but the damage was done, and it shouldn't have happened in the first place. You arrested him without proper investigation. You made assumptions based on his appearance and his situation, and that's not how the law is supposed to work. Harris's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak right away. I've already spoken to the district attorney, Richard continued. There's going to be an internal review of how this case was handled, and I'm going to make sure people know what really happened. Harris's face darkened. You're pushing this pretty hard, Cole. It was a mistake, but I followed procedure. Did you? Richard asked, his voice cold. Or did you just take the easy way out? You saw a homeless man and you thought, case closed. You didn't bother to ask the right questions or look deeper into the evidence. If I hadn't intervened, an innocent man would be rotting in jail right now. Harris's eyes flicked away for a moment, but when he looked back at Richard, his expression was hard. I've been on the force a long time. I've seen cases like this before. Sometimes you have to go with your gut. Your gut is wrong, Richard snapped. And your gut nearly destroyed a man's life. If you'd done your job properly, you'd have seen the evidence didn't add up. But you didn't care, did you? You just wanted a quick resolution. Harris didn't respond, his face stony. Richard took a step closer, his voice low and controlled. There are consequences for what you did. You're going to be held accountable for your actions. People like you, people who cut corners and make assumptions, are the reason why innocent men like Jamal Turner get caught up in a system that's supposed to protect them. Harris's hands clenched at his sides, but he didn't say anything. Richard could see the frustration boiling beneath the surface, but it didn't matter. The wheels were already in motion, and Harris knew it. This isn't just about Jamal, Richard added. It's about every other person who's been treated like he was. You don't get to play with people's lives because it's convenient. With that, Richard turned and walked away, leaving Harris standing in the lobby, silent and brooding. As Richard stepped outside, the cold air hit him, but he felt a strange sense of calm. The battle wasn't over, but it had started. Harris, and others like him, would learn that there were consequences for failing to do their job, and Richard wasn't going to stop until justice was truly served. The soft hum of the city filled Richard's office as he stared out at the skyline, the evening sun casting a golden glow over the towering buildings. He had spent weeks cleaning up the mess left behind by the robbery and the betrayal that followed. Jamal was settling into his new role, and the company was running smoothly again. But there were still loose ends that needed tying up, both with Detective Harris and Sophia Martinez. As Richard sat at his desk, his phone buzzed. It was Robert Mitchell from the district attorney's office. Richard answered quickly, his heart beating a little faster. Robert, what do you have for me? You'll be happy to know that Detective Harris is officially off the force, Robert replied, his tone firm but relieved. The internal investigation found enough evidence to show a pattern of misconduct. His rush to judgment with Jamal was the final nail in the coffin. He's been forced to resign, and there's talk of further legal action for dereliction of duty. Richard exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lift from his chest. That's good to hear. Harris nearly ruined an innocent man's life because of his carelessness. He deserves every consequence coming his way. I couldn't agree more, Robert said. But there's more. Sophia Martinez, well, she's not getting away either. After she was escorted out of your company, we followed the paper trail you helped uncover. Turns out, her embezzlement scheme ran deeper than we thought. She's facing charges for fraud and theft. Her trial is set for next month. Richard's lips tightened, but he felt no satisfaction. I knew it ran deep, but I didn't realize how far it went. Robert paused, then spoke more gently. You did everything right, Richard. You caught it before it got worse, and you prevented more damage. She'll face the consequences for her actions. Richard nodded. It's not just about her getting what she deserves. It's about accountability. Harris didn't do his job, and Sophia betrayed her position. People need to know that they can't just exploit the system or people. You're right, Robert agreed. And thanks to your persistence, both are being held accountable. The system isn't perfect, but this time, justice is being served. Richard thanked Robert and hung up, sitting back in his chair. He allowed himself a moment to process it all. Detective Harris, the man who had arrested Jamal without proper investigation, was gone. Sophia, his trusted assistant who had orchestrated the robbery and framed Jamal, was on her way to trial. The pieces were falling into place, and those who had wronged Jamal and the company were being held to account. His thoughts were interrupted by another knock on the door. Jamal stepped inside, a quiet confidence in his posture, dressed neatly in his work clothes. Richard, Jamal greeted, a small smile playing at his lips. Got a minute? Of course. Come in, Richard said, gesturing for him to sit. Jamal took a seat, glancing around the office before meeting Richard's gaze. I just wanted to check in. It's been a while since everything went down, and I wanted to thank you again for everything. You've thanked me enough, Richard said, his voice sincere. But you're welcome. You earned this chance, Jamal. I'm just glad you were able to take it. Jamal nodded, his expression growing more serious. I heard about Harris and Sophia. It's good to know they're facing consequences for what they did. They are, Richard confirmed. Harris is off the force and Sophia's facing charges. They won't be able to hurt anyone else. Jamal leaned back in his chair, a look of satisfaction settling on his face. That's good. It feels like things are finally right. I never thought I'd see this day. You've come a long way, Richard said, his tone warm. You've put in the work, and people here respect you. You've earned everything that's coming to you. Jamal smiled, his eyes glinting with hope. I never thought I'd be here, not after everything, but I'm ready for whatever comes next. So am I, Richard replied, feeling a rare sense of contentment. This is just the beginning for both of us. As Jamal stood to leave, Richard looked at him, remembering the man who had once been broken by a system that had nearly failed him. Now, Jamal was standing tall, his future bright. Once Jamal left the office, Richard turned back to the city. Harris was gone. Sophia would face trial, and Jamal, once a victim of their recklessness, was now on a path to success. For Richard, it was more than a victory. It was a reminder that when you fight for what's right, change is possible. And with that, Richard knew that the story, though full of struggles and betrayals, had found its resolution. Justice had been served, and for the first time in a long time, the future looked bright for everyone who deserved it.